Dearly beloved, we gather here today to mourn the loss of our friend, Stabbington the Thrice Orphaned. Lovable rogue, or so their 13-page backstory claims. But let's not focus on their death. Attacking a high-level retired adventurer bartender, that could happen to anyone. Let's focus on their life. Oh. Seems they died on their first adventure. Oh well. Hi folks, welcome to Glitter Void Gamecraft. My name is Eric, and today I'm building a graveyard centerpiece. The chapel and the graveyard. Name a more classic combination. Whether it's a quiet park of remembrance, a haunted sepulchre of decay, or somewhere in between, your players are gonna be at one of these at some point during your campaign. If for no other reason than to justify all the time you spent painting all of those skeleton minis. A locale of mysteries, a target of quests, and, for suitably flexible character alignments, a place you can do some good old-fashioned grave robbing. Towards the end of the video, I give you some ideas of ways you could use this piece of terrain at the table, but for now, let's get digging, let's get crafting. My vision for this graveyard is a central piece, probably where the oldest and most important graves are located. A main entrance leads to some kind of brick path with two side entrances to increase access. The whole piece has a wrought iron fence around it with a brick foundation and maybe some decorative feature in the middle. A small entrance to a crypt or catacomb or something towards the back will break up lines of sight for a more tactically interesting piece of terrain, with some sort of arch over the main gate for visual interest. The base is made from a 12 by 12 inch square of chipboard. This is a very thin cardboard, or very thick cardstock, that is quite strong. It does tend to warp, so I'm trying something new to fight that. Mod Podge, that classic crafting base coat, is usually added towards the end, but here I'm trying it at the beginning. Hopefully it provides enough of a seal to prevent the chipboard from sucking up too much moisture from all the glues and paints and washes I'll be adding later. I gloop a ton on one side, let it dry, then do the other, weighing it down so that it holds its shape. So far it looks good, but we'll have to see how it stands up to crafting. I rounded the corners with scissors and then nicked the sides to create a wavy shape, so the space between the fence foundation and the edge of the piece looked more natural. I marked about an inch in from the edges, which would have been easier to do before trimming the edges, note to self. This marks the inner edge of the foundation, making for an easier placement of the bricks and keeping the inner playable area a solid 10 by 10 inches. I marked the position of the various gates and planned to do the same for the pathways, but I was second guessing a solid brick path at this point. The stone posts and the main gate I cut from XPS insulation foam. The trick to cutting foam this thick is to make many shallow cuts. Especially with very flexible blades like mine, if you push too hard, the cuts come out wavy instead of straight and smooth. I used two of the larger pieces for the main gate, trimming them down to size and removing the shiny outer layer that sometimes doesn't take paint very well. I cut some of the others down to be used for the smaller stone fence posts on the corners and for the side gates. The bricks for the fence wall are made from dollar store foam core board and is a great way to use up scrap pieces. I don't have a hot wire table, so using the thickness of the boards as the height of the bricks is a convenient way to make sure these walls are all the same height. The width of the bricks can be whatever you want. I went with somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 inch, mostly so it wouldn't be wider than the smaller fence posts. I measured and cut a few bricks and then stopped bothering with measurements, eyeballing the sizes. A mighty horde produced, it was time to start texturing all the surfaces. For rapid texturing of small bits, find a container and collect and clean various shaped rocks. Dump the bits into the container, seal the lid, and shake vigorously. Now you have a whole mess of textured bricks with very little effort. Not only does this texture all the flat surfaces of the bricks, but it also gets rid of the crisp edges and sharp corners and makes everything feel more natural. I cut in shallow grout lines in the stone using an X-Acto and then textured with my trusty ball of foil, making sure all the corners are rounded. I expanded the grout lines with a mechanical pencil, the lead retracted. The main gate posts are similar, just with a more complex pattern to make it more imposing. several flat pieces, and alternating positions for the bricks. Using tacky glue, I attached the posts before the foundation of the fence to help with the placing of the bricks. I used the same glue to attach the foundation, glooping it on a whole wall segment before placing the individual bricks. Here you can see how having slight variations in the width of the bricks adds texture to the wall. The ends of most layers weren't a perfect fit, so I measured and cut a brick to fill the gap. I repeated this for each level, making sure to offset each layer from the previous, which usually involved cutting a brick in half to begin the offset. For the pathway, I decided on weathered tiles instead of a dense brick path to suggest a playable grid. I cut the squares slightly less than an inch so there would be space in between each tile for grass and dirt to hang out in. Since I already had it out, I decided to try texturing the tiles using the rocks. I've never used this on such large pieces and was a little concerned they might break, but they came out fine, which may come in handy when making larger courtyards and such. I got to work on the pathway. Playing without a grid isn't much of an issue in small indoor spaces, but in large open areas it's harder to keep track of spacing without a literal grid. Tiles help keep the grid on the mind better than a big open grassy areas, but also take up space that could be used for burial plots. Form and function continue to fight in my head, so I waited to glue anything down for now. I raised the crypt/mausoleum entrance up on a small platform, then gave it a roof overhang and a small border piece to create a lip at the top. To inset the door, I cut out the frame and added a backing piece, then formed the various wooden plank and stone textures. I started to glue the walls together, but then decided to add more grout lines, matching the stone trim pattern from the chapel. I finished gluing the walls together, but left the roof separate to make painting easier. To create the wrought iron fence segments, I cut lengths of BBQ skewers for the horizontal bars, taping them down to keep them from rolling. I decided I wanted the vertical bars to vary in height to create a curve or up and down pattern. I left the ends irregular for now. I'll trim them to the correct height when I attach the fence segments after painting. The various gates for the 3 different entrances were made in the same way. I made the headstones of various shapes using various types of foam. I recommend doing some research online to get inspired for headstone design. Mixing looks makes the graveyard feel more organic and aged than just having a bunch of square, plain, bland-looking ones. I used cardstock from food packaging to create various detail pieces for each headstone. You don't need every possible grave plot filled, just enough to break up any wide open spaces. Time to actually place the things. I toyed with the idea of putting the crypt entrance in a non-central location, but in the end thought that having more corners to hide behind was ultimately more interesting. I glued the crypt down first, as the spacing of the path was easier to adjust if my measurements weren't exactly perfect, and weighted it down to dry. I gave about half the stones some sort of distress, cracks, chips, fully broken stones, making sure to add texture to any new cuts. A large hunk of XPS foam formed the arch. I fiddled with my compass to try to create an inner surface of the arch. This didn't work well, but even if it had worked, I knew it was going to be hard to cut the inner edge, basically just taking increasingly smaller wedges out, and filed the rest down. This might be something you could accomplish with some sort of coping saw, but I don't have one, so I may do. I cut and filed the top, then carved in grout lines. I immediately messed up by cutting down the center, which is where the keystone of the arch needs to be. I don't know enough about engineering to know if this makes the arch impossible, but I do know that I'm not cutting out a new one. I glued it in place and pinned it until it was dry. I scattered the headstones about to get an idea how it would all look together, and then attached them with hot glue. Normally on pieces this small I'd be worried about the glue glooping out, but I plan to cover the entire ground with various types of ground cover, which should hide any mess. It's also hard to beat the strength and speed of hot glue. The next step is messy, so I laid out some parchment paper to protect my work surface. For the first layer of ground cover, I glued PVA glue on all the ground surfaces. I spread it out with a brush, making sure the glue was pushed up against all the walls, tiles, and headstones. Then I dumped on the sand. I used weights to help fight warping from all the moisture in the glue while it dried. The walls were particularly helpful for this, as I could balance various heavy bottles and such very close to the edges, which is where the warping tends to occur the most. Once the glue had dried, I dumped off the excess. This makes a very durable ground cover, which is made even more sturdy when sealed in by the base coat. Next, I went after all the smaller areas in between the tiles, the edges outside the fence, and anything that got missed on the first application. Any overspilled sand can be saved for future use. Somehow in the process of applying sand, I broke off 2 of the fence posts, so I quickly reattached them before moving on. Another small issue. The 2 layers of the roof of the crypt had a small gap where the grout lines met the top layer. This is probably not visible to anyone, but it bothered me, so I filled the gaps with glue and hit them with sand. I don't even know how this keeps happening, but I broke a 3rd post. At this point, I knew I needed to reinforce them, since they're going to likely get even more abused on the playing table. I pre-poked holes in the base with a toothpick, glooped some glue on the base and the stick, and shish kebabbed the top piece, clearing up any overflow glue. On the unbroken pieces, I just snapped it off in the middle, as I didn't trust my ability to push a toothpick through a piece of foam that long, and repeated the process. I gave everything the usual base coat of Mod Podge mixed with black craft paint. Weighing down the bases using the stone fence foundations was so successful, I repeated that with the base coat, coating the tops of the walls of the tiles first so that they would be dry when I got to the larger areas. While the weight balancing surfaces dried, I began to look for other areas that needed a finer touch. One of the grave plots was supposed to be a freshly buried coffin, so I put down a thick square of glue and sprinkled it on with the sand to create a slightly raised area. The corners of the crypt needed some sort of detail. I took some rectangles of cardstock and scored them at the centers, not cutting all the way through. This allowed me to fold them over the corners with a nice sharp edge, as well as to hide the seams of the wall pieces. I ran the pieces long and cut away the excess after the glue had dried. I also added some small rocks on the outside of the wall. I simply dropped them in place and dripped super glue on them. Finally, the actual base coat. Normally I mix this with water to help it flow into the crevices, but I avoided that with such a large and warpable base, instead just dampening the brush slightly. Besides the usual hardening and protecting of the foam, this also seals in all the sand on the ground. This piece will not shed once it dries. I weighted it all down and let the whole thing dry overnight. I painted most of the stone with a deep gray base coat. This is darker than I usually do for stone, but as a graveyard, I wanted it to have a more sinister vibe. Dry brushing in a light gray really made the textures pop. All of the edges of the bricks and the cracks. I used this same light gray to base coat the headstones since I wanted them to look different than the rest of the stone. To base coat the ground, I used brown mixed with a little black. Perfect coverage isn't really necessary, as much of this would be hidden beneath grass. Even though a little brown on various things would just look like dirt or mud kicked up on the rocks, I switched to a smaller brush to get in between the tiles. Again, not really bothering for full coverage. I used a dull copper for the metallic details and a golden brown for the wooden door and as a dry brush on the ground. For the iron fence segments and gates, I tried a new scheme for rusty metal. I skipped a base coat and just used regular brown paint. The brown is the only full coverage paint, and since I find painting rounded toothpicks and barbecue skewers obnoxious, of which there are more than 100 in this project, that was a plus. Keeping the paint thin, I was able to move right on to the next step, a gunmetal dry brush. This is a fairly thorough coverage, leaving a little bit of brown showing through in the recesses to imply rust. Finally, a black dry brush to give it that menacing wrought iron look, but leaving a little of the gunmetal showing to imply a worn surface. Now for the washes, after I make a new batch apparently. Everything so far got a coat of the homemade black wash, which I apparently didn't record. I then dry brushed the whole thing in suede. Ground, rocks, everything. Painting completed, I glued the roof to the crypt. For the living ground cover, I used a mixture of different kinds of flocking, store-bought foam and nylon static grass, and homemade hemp grass. I attached all this using a watered-down PVA glue that I brushed on in large patches. I dusted on the basic foam flocking, tapped it down, and shook off the excess. I made some lighter grass by chopping up some hemp-like cord into fine grass, very similar to a store-bought static grass. I broke up any of the bits that were wound too tightly together and applied it in smaller patches. I didn't love the starkness of the color, but another round of wash later would darken it somewhat. Time to attach the iron fence. Not wanting the spikes to be absurdly high, I cut off a lot of the bottom of each vertical bar. I had to trim some of the horizontal bars as well, but mostly because I had intentionally measured it long at each end to avoid coming up short. I dabbed tacky glue on the contact points and wedged the iron fence pieces in, cleaning up any extra glue before it dries. I installed the gates in a similar way, but there was an issue with the front gate. I messed up somewhere in my measurements, causing an overlap. Since there wasn't any excess horizontal bar to trim off, I had to choose between losing a vertical bar, which would reduce the surface I could apply glue on, or setting the doors askew. I went with the sturdier askew option. The flocking, especially the dead grass, looked a little loose. To secure and seal it, I used a mixture of water and rubbing alcohol and diluted PVA glue. That's a whole topic itself that I may detail in another video, but basically the alcohol breaks up the surface tension and lets the watered down glue permeate the whole surface. Nothing will move after this dries. There's a problem with this door. I don't like it. It doesn't make sense that an eternal resting place has a decomposable door. I'm changing this up. I took a piece of XPS foam and cut it down to the size of the doorway. I cut, textured, and painted it to look like stone and created a bunch of cardstock detail pieces, painting them just like the crypt corner details in a copper. This actually became my favorite detail of the whole build, so it was a good move. Besides discouraging grave robbing, the thickness of the door gives it a lot of surface to glue on when I cut the old door away. I did just that and gently tapped the door into place. To muss up the iron fence a little, I clipped a few points and whole segments here and there. I used dark inks to hide any of the exposed wood that was created when I cut the toothpicks. I mixed up a dark wash with the leftover ink and hid a few of the large patches of grass that looked a bit too uniform. With natural things like this, more colors add texture and dimension. After that was dry, it was time to give the whole thing a coat of matte varnish. And voila, a graveyard centerpiece. As a craft, I'm super pleased with the small amount of warping on the chipboard base that I got away with. Normally I might try to brute force it perfectly flat, but the iron fence is too rigid and might break away from the posts. A graveyard is a classic location for any tabletop game, as it is important to any city of any size. The crypt is a great entrance to a larger subterranean dungeon without requiring the party to venture too far from the safety of the town. And honestly, the adventure necromancer takes over the graveyard and plagues the town with their undead minions practically writes itself. Tactically, this build has lots of options as well. Multiple points of ingress, all sorts of cover, and even some verticality. Multiple places for new enemies, especially the undead, to appear. Very useful if you like to modify encounters on the fly. The large area feels sufficiently epic for that final showdown boss zone, without it just being another subterranean grey room. Naturally, being on its own separate base, you can configure this with the chapel to whatever orientation you wish it to be, whether it's nearby or across the road or what have you.
Spooky, scary skeletons, they want initiative. Shrieking skulls will haunt your soul and poke you with the shiv.
Well, if that spectacular build hasn't scared you off yet, or the fact that I'm making Halloween jokes in what is currently the spring, I hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, consider giving it a thumbs up and let me know in the comments what your favorite undead to use in something like this would be. If you found anything particularly useful, consider subscribing to the channel or sharing it with a friend or your dungeon master. That all really helps me out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.